The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The culture is collapsing around us. Will anybody stand up for civilization? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We are now in the midst of a cultural revolution, plain and simple. It's now conventional wisdom that the U.S. is guilty of not just racism, but systemic racism, meaning the system is rigged against people because they are black. We will examine this proposition from multiple angles. LibertyNation.com national columnist and Heartland correspondent Sarah Cowgill joins us to discuss the disbelief among workaday Americans about what they're seeing in the streets. And we'll discuss who the true culprits are for the systemic racism in urban police departments. Spoiler alert, it's not Republicans. Plus, we will do something the progressives refuse to do, present the full truth about the history of slavery. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza breaks down a couple of significant Supreme Court decisions this week which could strengthen transgender rights and weaken the Second Amendment.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. This wailing and gnashing of teeth over the George Floyd affair is at one level understandable among rank-and-file citizens who do not obsess over politics and race and were appalled by the slow-motion execution of an unarmed man accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. But the immediate aftershock should have calmed down enough for those elected to stand up for the rule of law to, well, do exactly that. But instead, we see a succession of earnest-sounding, butt-covering statements, often stipulating to the truth of systemic racism, and disclaimers from both sides saying essentially, hey, I'm not like those racist conservatives, not me. I'm upright on all matters racial. Where are the voices standing up for Western civilization? Yes, Western civilization. Folks, how about a quick reality check? We fought a civil war over slavery, the only nation ever to do so. About 1 million Americans, the equivalent of more than 10 million today, including 600,000 soldiers, lost their lives in a twilight struggle against slavery. Oceans of blood, sweat, and tears have been expended on the civil rights movement, which produced concrete change. Affirmative action led to guaranteed preferential treatment for blacks in the workplace. We elected a black president. And then, even though he was not altogether popular, we re-elected him. Does this signal a system rotten to its racist core? The broad mass of public opinion, if not simple common sense, tells us that black lives not only matter, but should have value equal to all others. But while many conservatives are shaking with fear at responding to all this madness, the president is not. Donald Trump seems to be the only one willing to speak clearly and forcefully against the precipitous rise of forces seeking to take a jackhammer to the American project. He announced an executive order on police this week that will ban chokeholds, enforce independent credentialing of cops, and offer incentives for local departments to bring on experts in mental health and addiction and homelessness as co-responders to help the police. Here's how he framed it.
Reducing crime and raising standards are not opposite goals. They are not mutually exclusive. They work together. They all work together. That is why today I'm signing an executive order encouraging police departments nationwide to adopt the highest professional standards to serve their communities.
But as Trump tries to process and make sense of all the mayhem surrounding him, even though he had nothing to do with COVID-19 or the Floyd killing or the nationwide protests that followed, the left continues their endless virtue signaling on race, which we're used to by now. But we never really get used to hypocrisy, do we? And Virginia Governor Ralph Northam took it to a new level this week. You would think the man who has come to be known as Governor Blackface following the release of his old yearbook page with a guy in blackface and another in a KKK hood would lay low. But instead, he actually went on NBC this week and acted like the picture with the blackface and the KKK hood was just a big nothing, and then proceeded to lecture the nation.
We've had 2 very thorough investigations, and those investigations showed no evidence of me being in the picture. But I will tell you, Jeff, this isn't about me anymore. This is really about Virginia. It's about this country. It's about black oppression. It's about systemic racism. What I didn't realize and what I have learned is really that black oppression exists here, is alive and well in 2020.
The absence of shame is breathtaking, isn't it? But Northam's fellow Virginian, Senator Tim Kaine, you may remember him as Hillary Clinton's running mate, might have been even worse when he took to the floor of the United States Senate and said this.
The first African Americans into the English colonies came to Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. They were slaves. They'd been captured against their will. But they landed in colonies that didn't have slavery. There were no laws about slavery in the colonies at that time. The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
That is a lie of biblical proportions. In fact, if Tim Kaine would pick up a Bible, he'd see slavery goes back not just centuries, but millenniums or millennia to biblical times. Slavery operated in the first civilizations in Mesopotamia, dating back to 3500 BC. Slavery was common in much of Europe during the Middle Ages, continued there for centuries. The Ottoman Wars in Europe for 600 or 700 years before America existed resulted in the capture of large numbers of Christian slaves. Don't hear anything about that, do you? And a number of West African kingdoms played a prominent role in the Atlantic slave trade, especially after 1600, the exact form of slavery that the left is decrying these days. But Tim Kaine and his fellow travelers on the left claim the United States of America created slavery. And speaking of lies and hypocrisy, we've got more of both. How about Joe Biden, who calls Trump a racist and stands by as Confederate statues are torn down by Antifa and the other anarchists? But when you've been a professional politician for over 40 years, your words often come back to haunt you.
The senator made a very moving and eloquent speech as a son of the Confederacy, acknowledging that it was time to change and yield to a position not granting a federal charter to a organization made up of many fine people who continue to display the Confederate flag.
Many fine people? Many fine people? Isn't that what the Trump-deranged progressives accused Trump of saying about the white supremacists in the infamous Charlottesville episode? But true to form on the left, that was a lie of monstrous proportions, since Trump specifically condemned the white supremacists and said some of the people simply trying to protect history were very fine people. But facts no longer matter on the left. Narrative is everything. Put another way, if you've got facts on one side and you've got narrative on the other, even if it's entirely untrue, go with the narrative, because you can be sure you'll receive more than adequate protection from a legacy media bent on taking down Trump by any means which avail themselves. Facts be damned. But facts, not narrative, are what were delivered in a YouTube video this week that went viral of a black woman, Beverly Beatty, schooling a bunch of idealistic, uninformed white progressives on a street corner on the true history of slavery, racism, and the Democratic Party.
These Democrats, and I'm sorry to say this, I'm not trying to be racist, but they hate black people. These are the same people who fought to keep slavery in. These are the same people who built the KKK. These are the same people who hated us from the beginning. The Republican Party is the party of the blacks. Blacks free, the Republican Party is the only party that the black people actually assisted in finding. But all of that history has been torn away. People say, oh, there was this big switch. There was never a big switch. So what happened was, once slavery was abolished in the South, the people in the South could no longer make their money from slaves. They had to move to the North to work in the industry to produce. And so the people in the North that already had established themselves in the industry moved to the South. And so that's where it was a transfer of people coming from the South to the North and people coming from the North to the South. There was never a big switch. So the same Democrats who hated black people from the beginning are the same ones who hate us now, and they use our cause. How did Black Lives Matter turn into something about LGBTQ when blacks really don't support that? We're conservative. We're really not about that. Not only that, we don't support abortion. We're about working. This is the black culture. We ain't never been about that. Not only that, we're not about feminism. No, we're not. Black women marry their husbands and respect their husbands. That's what we on. We're not on this, oh, I do what I want. We don't do that. That's not our community.
Well, now that I saved you hours of slaving over dusty history books with that concise and actually accurate summation of slavery in the Democratic Party, you're welcome. So, how are normal, everyday Americans in the nation's heartland responding to the bedlam in the streets of our great cities? We'll tell you when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Antifa and Black Lives Matter on a rampage. Widespread protests, riots, untold property damage, monuments and statues standing for decades toppled or smashed. 6 cops shot dead. 50 more injured in D.C. alone. The Church of Presidents in flames. The Secret Service employing President Trump to seek shelter in the White House bunker. Is this America? Really? Well, it certainly isn't for the broad mass of Americans watching in disbelief from outside the large urban centers racked by violence and racial balkanization. And so, to bring us back to earth with a perspective from what the elites in Washington call flyover country, the heartland of America is LibertyNation.com national columnist and Heartland correspondent Sarah Cowgill. It is such a pleasure to have you back, Sarah.
Oh, it's always fun to check in with people in the swamp.
Well, you gotta straighten us out here, because one of the things that's been most discouraging about the culture just collapsing around us is the seeming lack of pushback from the forces of civilization. Just how are the everyday folks in the heartland responding to all this?
Well, that's a two-pronged answer. Number one, we don't have these giant liberally run cities, peppering our states. So we're kind of wondering why, the mayor of Seattle and the mayor of Olympia, who called, the thugs that defaced her house domestic terrorists after she praised them for protesting, it's like, why aren't you doing something about that? Now, but on the other side of that coin, we just watch them pander. We watch these people pander to a small faction of radical goofballs, and all it's doing is building a base to vote against them. I don't get it.
Well, as you told me earlier, we're not afraid of these people, and we're trying to figure out why everybody else is. But how about the reaction in the heartland to Black Lives Matter being mainstreamed by the media to the point that a whole array of racial programming is at the top of the Prime Video app, for example? Famous people are virtue signaling like never before, and companies far and wide are bending the knee to Black Lives Matter.
We find that ridiculous. Flyover people are really, really based in common sense and logic. And they, number one, they probably saw it coming. Number two, when they see it, they tune it out now. Literally, within the last 2 weeks, people have gone from, oh, that man was murdered by that Minneapolis cop, to, oh, my God, shut up already. Nobody, it's done here. Nobody cares anymore. They just, they've made up their minds, and nobody cares. We don't care if Aunt Jemima is no longer on a pancake mix, because most people around here make everything from scratch. We don't care if Uncle Ben's rice is no longer an African-American man on the cover of the rice packaging. No, we just don't care. We just are ready to move on.
Sarah, in the media business, we have what we call pull quotes, which are notable quotables within an interview. And that right there is that. And we don't care if Aunt Jemima's off the shelf. We make our own pancakes. That's absolutely the response I would have hoped for from our Heartland correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Now, let's switch gears a little bit here. We're told that a big part of the reason that Joe Biden was picked as the Democratic presidential nominee is that he has great appeal in the heartland, where Trump almost ran the table in 2016. Have you found this to be the case?
Well, maybe in 2008, because nobody liked John McCain so much, and Obama thought he needed an old white guy to balance out the ticket. Somebody who was a little more old dog Democrat versus a progressive. But in 2012, he was just a joke. And now here we are, and everybody thinks Joe's got dementia. They don't even consider him a viable threat to Trump.
Thank you, Sarah.
Anytime, Tim. It is such a pleasure to have a little chat with you.
Sarah Cowgill, national columnist for LibertyNation.com. Stay right there, because when we return, we'll do some more straightening of the truth as we ask the question, who's responsible for bad cops? Quick preview, it's not the Republicans.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future, and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
If you just flew in from Siberia or landed your spaceship on Earth anytime over the last 2 or 3 weeks, you could be excused for believing that this problem between cops and communities of color, long thorny, but now as explosive as a powder keg, is the sole responsibility of Republicans, conservatives, and Donald Trump, not necessarily in that order. I mean, certainly the great cities that have been declared by leftist politicians and big media outlets and wizened academics as cesspools for systemic racism, the latest mantra for those serious about their virtue signaling, must be ruled by those white privileged Republicans, right? Oh, wait. Let's step back for just a moment and consider some facts that are utterly inconvenient to the cultural Marxists having a field day at the expense of decent, normal Americans. This default position about the race-tarnished right is not only untrue, it's the opposite of the truth. Who exactly is responsible for the behavior of the police? It's the mayors and councils elected to run our cities. And who is it that negotiates with police unions in contracts that cover everything from compensation to the adjudication of misconduct charges? Why, it's those same politicians. And what party has been running these cities forever? Well, what do you know? The Democrats. So when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is hit with 17 misconduct complaints and none of them are adjudicated, exactly who is ultimately responsible for the 18th incident which stoked race riots across the land? Consider New York and Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, Baltimore, among others, all ruled by Democrats, all hit by post-George Floyd riots, all with major police problems, all with a wide assortment of important black Democratic officials. No GOP fingerprints anywhere. Put a finer point on it, just one of the nation's top 10 largest cities and 5 of the top 30 have Republican mayors, Republican rule. And as much of urban America was under siege, not one of those GOP-run cities were hit by major insurrections. Who is responsible for the type of persistent poverty, crime, joblessness, and misery that leads to the violence and racial balkanization we've been forced to witness? Maybe it has something to do with the people who've governed those cities for decades. But we need to go further back than that. Progressives have been animated by the 1619 Project, the brainchild of the Trump-addled New York Times, claiming that the true founding of this nation was 401 years ago, 1619, when slave ships arrived on our shores. They argue that it created a white supremacist footprint so deep and wide that it can never be remedied, only destroyed. So then let's go ahead and review what's actually happened over those 401 years. First, slavery, which was embedded in the culture before America's independence, but after the founding, it was a lifestyle for Democrats and opposed by Republicans. Remember Abe Lincoln? Then segregation, lynchings, the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws, all fostered in the former Confederacy, the virtually exclusive domain of, you guessed it, Democrats. But that's old news, say the Democrats. We're different since the days of the Civil Rights Movement. So how are Democrats to blame for the explosion of racial violence which followed the execution of George Floyd? For Exhibit A, let's connect a couple of dots that are obvious to normal people but buried by the left. Gross police misconduct and the end-to-end progressive leadership of Minneapolis. The larger of Minnesota's Twin Cities features a young, uber-progressive mayor in way over his head and a 100% Democratic city council. Now, one comment by Council President Lisa Bender tells you all you need to hear. After she and her colleagues endorsed the full defunding of their police department, she was asked how she would respond to the concerns of, say, a homeowner trying to fend off an attacker in a police-free environment. And Lisa Bender, City Council President of Minneapolis, said that question, quote, comes from a place of privilege. Really, She actually said that. As for Donald Trump, the perpetual target of unhinged leftist rage, perhaps a little math will bring perspective on the 4 centuries-long steaming cauldron of white supremacy depicted by those shark-toothed progressives. They blame Trump for the riots as they have for everything else. But if you pull out your calculators for just a moment, or don't bother to, because I'll do it for you, you'll notice that Trump has been president for exactly 7/1,000ths of 1% of the time since the true founding of the country. 0.007%. So much damage in so little time, apparently. Just how much wreckage must be strewn across the landscape before we come clean about the unmitigated nightmare that has been the rule of the Democratic Party over urban America? The media will never connect the dots. And, of course, neither will the ivory tower academic Marxists undergirding the political class as they poison the minds of our youth with deconstructionist lectures from the safety of their ivory towers. They're largely responsible for fomenting the present movement to tear down society as we know it. William F. Buckley once said famously that he would rather be governed by the first 1,000 people listed in the phone book, remember that, than by faculty members from an Ivy League university. Amen to that. The only promising option for reining in the cops without abandoning the rule of law is to actually strip authority from the spectacularly incompetent Democratic politicians who have for decades demonstrated an inability or unwillingness to rein in police misbehavior. Or, since these riot-torn cities generally refuse to elect Republicans except temporarily to clean up messes left by particularly incompetent Democrats, maybe it's time to even consider privatizing the police. After all, could the private sector, or even a bunch of randomly selected individuals with a lick of common sense, possibly do any worse than the Democratic Party? Quick break, and then we're back to discuss a very busy week for the Supreme Court on Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, which is, to most or all of you, self-explanatory. It's when we reintroduce our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man we like to call the guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
What a pleasure, Tim.
I wanted an uplifting opening
right.
Because I'm not sure that what we're going to talk about,
or not, depending on your point of view.
What we're going to talk about after that is not necessarily so good. But let's call it what it is. It's high season for the Supreme Court, and not just for legal eagles like yourself, but those of us who are interested observers, as I like to call myself, hopefully informed observer. And SCOTUS has added gay and trans individuals to Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a significant ruling, but one I would contend is entirely unsurprising.
Well, I think that the surprising feature about it is the rationale given and the author of the majority opinion, or the court's opinion, yes. Tim. Mm-hmm. And this was a decision authored by Justice Gorsuch, a Trump appointee. And the rationale for the ruling is that the plain language of the law requires the inclusion of these people as protectees under the law. The law says that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex in hiring or firing. And what Justice Gorsuch's opinion says is the very nature of hiring or firing somebody because they are gay or trans necessitates that you've taken sex into account in that ruling. And I think it's a positive ruling for limited government advocates on the basis of that rationale. Justice Gorsuch hasn't said, and the court, by the majority opinion, by those justices who've signed on, not just, Tim, to the result in the case, but the reasoning in the case, is that if Congress wants to exclude these classifications, they can pass a new law to do so. Now, that's
let the legislature deal with it.
Practically speaking, that's not going to happen,
right.
I can tell you. But it is the appropriate posture, I think, for a Supreme Court justice to take, which is we're not going to massage the law to fit into what we think you meant or should mean or would like it to mean. We've got the words on the page, and if they indicate a certain response from us, that's the response you're going to get. Now, I will hasten to add that Justice Thomas, among the other dissenters, basically thought that this was legislating from the bench on the part of their colleagues.
The problem is that the left is always a reliable vote for the progressive agenda. They never, ever break from it. And yet, on the right, we say you need to follow the law, but if you follow the law, you're going to get results you don't want. So it's a results-based leftist bloc versus a law-based, mostly, conservative bloc, as we lay it out that way.
I don't have the site for where he said it, but I recall that Clarence Thomas, I think, once talked about the way of judging for first you don't decide who should win, and then backfill the opinion to get to that point. You go through you start with the Constitution, presumably, and then you decide. And it seems to me, Tim, that the conservative justices do seem to be more interested in intellectual honesty there rather than results-oriented jurisprudence.
I think it's also clear through this decision and a couple of others that John Roberts, the Chief Justice, is headed for David Souterville in the minds of conservatives because he has become he has a judicial philosophy which is hard to discern.
It seems hard to discern, and also we now have, because of the various statements back and forth over the past year, perhaps some grudge between he and the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. We have the DACA rescission, which is to say that the Supreme Court has ruled that the Trump administration acted in contravention of the law when they rescinded the DACA program put into place by Barack Obama. And that's a big loss for the Trump administration, and the way they did it. I presume that that Chief Justice Roberts has an ego as well, as do so many.
Really,
right? And perhaps that
would
weigh part of his decision to vote with the liberals in ruling DACA was not legal.
And I think the problem that conservatives or free marketers or libertarians or that group of individuals have with the court is that there's judicial activism on one side and not the other. This is what I'm saying. And what the court didn't do or refused to do this week is equally troubling to defenders of the Second Amendment. There were, 10 cases that they could have heard, refused every one of them.
So the problem, Tim, is that the court articulated a clear standard that the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right. You got to focus in on that fundamental word. And the reason why is because the level of scrutiny that the justices are supposed to apply to laws that infringe on rights is different when it's a fundamental right, okay? You're wearing a plaid shirt today, and the right to wear a plaid shirt, you do have the right to wear a plaid shirt, but it's not a fundamental right. Yeah. Some fundamental rights are not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but yet they are held as fundamental. So you might think of discrimination based on race, for instance, or sex, that is part of the Civil Rights Act. Those things can be fundamental and not specifically listed. The Second Amendment is both. It's listed in the Second Amendment, and the Heller case says that it's a fundamental right. And the McDonald case applies that to the states. Full stop, Tim. What we have, though, is many jurisdictions around the country seem to have enacted laws which infringe on that right. And the Supreme Court should grant those cases to hear them and establish in the legacy of their own jurisprudence what those rights mean. They refuse to do so, we presume, because they don't want to give a win to the pro-gun side, which is to say we assume that the lefties on the court don't want to take this case because of what it might mean.
But there was no pushback from the constitutional bloc either.
We don't know what is in the minds of all the justices. The only justice, Tim, that actually wrote about the decision not to take the case was Justice Thomas, who wrote extensively about why the court should take this case and that they were basically in dereliction of their duty not to.
I think this also shows about Justice Gorsuch. Part of the reason that you've admired him is because he has real libertarian chops. Unlike a lot of the more establishment conservatives on the court, most of the rest of them, probably except for Thomas, right, who were establishment type judges who defend the establishment, deferential to the state.
I think that's right, yes.
But Gorsuch is not that way, right? And you identified that early, and for the most part, the right, as it's broadly defined, has been down with Neil Gorsuch. But now, I don't know that they like that independence, rule of law thing quite so much.
I would hope that they would take the time to read the court's opinion in the case, Tim, because, again, it is the justification that he uses is a conservative justification. And I think it's one that is hopeful for Justice Gorsuch's jurisprudence if you believe that fidelity to the Constitution is the most important thing.
Now, we had another issue that came up this week and has been the subject of fierce debate, and that is tasers, because of this new incident in Atlanta where the taser was stolen from the cops. The guy ran away, turned around, let it go twice, fired the taser twice, and then was gunned down. The guy, the cop is being 11 counts. He could face the death penalty. Let's talk about that first, because you often say that it's a major problem when in these high-profile cases the defendant is overcharged because it will wind up with an exoneration which will just set the radicals loose in the streets.
The Rayshard Brooks shooting certainly, Tim, bears the stamp of overcharging. The police officer in that case has been charged with how many attempted murders and assaults? I lost count while I was watching the press conference, and I happen to know that police academies across the country that use tasers all teach. In fact, they're all required by their legal agreements with taser. In other words, they're not going to be able to use tasers unless they agree to the following training protocols, so that they're consistent throughout departments. And part of that training says that if a person has your taser and goes to use it against you, the indication there is for you to use up to and including deadly force to stop it from happening and recover it.
Doesn't this mean that he's likely not going to be found guilty of felonious murder?
It's hard for me to see how he would be, with the exception of I heard that reported at the press conference that one of the police officers stood on the man's shoulders afterwards. Another one kicked him in the head. Those seem to be assaults that are irrelevant to an attempted murder, which has to do with the shooting. There seems to be a misconception in the public that police are only allowed to use deadly force if they're combating deadly force. That's not true. Every police officer and member of the public is allowed to use deadly force simply to stop serious bodily harm. So even a broken arm, if you were risking that, or the serious bodily harm that could come from being tased while running, like the police officer faced.
Hey, this may have been our best talk in Liberty ever.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio, plus LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising with Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose Where Past is Prologue, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And don't forget about the LibertyNation.com Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.